And let's open with a word of prayer. Dear God, we thank you for a wonderful day. We thank you for fellowship. We thank you for the multi-talented congregation we have that is so willing to share its expertise. And we thank you for the blessings of children, as we baptized one this morning, and of grandparents. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.
Amen.
And we thank you for heat.
And we thank you for Dr. Martin Luther King.
Yes,
Today.
yes.
Yes. And never forget Daisy's talk for the congregation. Really, she's an amazing person for her sharing her faith.
Okay. As I said, our speaker today is the multi-talented Bob Deans. And today he's going to talk about another dimension of our journey toward the intersections of faith and hope. And that is there any hope on climate change policy? You know, this gets very frustrating very quickly, but we see some signs of hope. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Bob, and I'm going to pin this so everybody can see Bob.
Thank you so much, Steve, and good morning, everybody. Happy Baptism Sunday. I will say that David gave yet another wonderful sermon this morning, during which he conveyed an admonition. I can't remember the full context, but it was, in effect, you are a beloved child of God, now act like it, which had echoes of something my own father used to tell me. So anyway, that was a wonderful thing to hear. And we did, of course, remember that we celebrate Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King's birthday. And as Carol was reminding us, it reminded me of the time when our daughter, when she was quite young, had the privilege of standing in the sanctuary and delivering a portion of his speech that she had memorized. And she later told me that she kept focused by concentrating on the dove above the balcony. So I always think of that when I see that.
Wonderful day, yes.
Anyway, as Steve said, we do look for signs of hope around the issue of climate change. And of course, it's particularly after a year that saw climate disasters, floods, storms, wildfires take 474 lives in our country alone. Cost of $165 billion in damages just in our country alone. And of course, we can't forget that we saw a third of Pakistan go underwater. The country, fifth most populous country in the world, lost maybe a third of its crops. And the Andes Mountains have lost a third of their water, water that nourishes peoples and their farms across the Andes. Third of that water has been lost as these glaciers have melted over time. And so we were reminded of the urgency of action on climate. But there's also enormous hope. For one thing, after many years of conversation in this city, Congress passed the strongest climate action in our history, $360 billion, actually closer to $370 billion in clean energy investments and incentives over the next 10 years, which is already creating a kind of an American renaissance in manufacturing, creating tens, not scores of thousands of jobs in states across the country, and red states and blue alike, Ohio, Michigan, Kentucky, Alabama, Georgia. We're talking about more than $30 billion, in fact, that in private corporate investment to build solar panels, to build wind turbines, to build electric cars and advanced batteries. Just a couple of weeks back, we saw an announcement in South Carolina, $3.5 billion for a plant to recycle batteries from cars. And it's my understanding that you can recycle something like 90% of what goes into a car battery, and so for an electric car. And so that's huge if we can get this closed loop situation. So very, very hopeful. The money in the Infrastructure Act, almost $1 trillion in investment, again, over, in this case, over 5 years. A lot of that money is going to help us advance the clean energy technology economy that we need to build, whether that is building electric charging stations coast to coast, so that, you know, makes it easier to drive electric cars. And so there's enormous reason for hope. What we need to do now in the coming year is focus on 3 things. Number one, we need to make sure that this historic strategic investment in our country's future is implemented in an effective and timely way, not delayed, not watered down, not misappropriated. And that's going to be a big job because a lot of this money goes through the states. And so there's a lot of advocacy that needs to be done to make sure that it is used properly, wisely, and in a way that accomplishes what we want it to accomplish, which is cutting our carbon pollution, creating jobs, making our communities more equitable, and ultimately making our country more secure. The second piece is that the administration has a lot to do. The administration has the authority under existing law to implement standards and rules that will complement this investment by, for example, cleaning up our cars, trucks, and dirty power plants, making our homes and workplaces more efficient, and cutting methane pollution from oil and gas operations. Methane is a very powerful greenhouse gas, of course, and making sure that investors are fully apprised of corporate climate risk, so that that goes into our equations when we invest. And so that's very important as well. And the third thing is we need to be mindful of the fact that the countries that have done the least to cause this problem are now paying the highest price for something that they didn't cause. And just a little bit of perspective. If you look at well, first of all, this is kind of a stunning thing, but we have burned more fossil fuels since 1990 than in all of history up until then.
Wow.
That's how fast we've accelerated. And so whenever people say, you know, when people say to me, you know, this is a bunch of nonsense, I say, well, it's actually common sense. If you take fuels that took, you know, scores of millions of years to produce, and we have burned in 30 years more than in all of mankind before, doesn't that tell you that we're kind of choking the atmosphere down with doesn't that tell you there's a problem? And there is a problem. And so the United States, Europe, Russia, and I say the United States, European Union, China, and Russia, these 4 entities are responsible for 63% of the carbon pollution that's in the atmosphere now. In other words, historically, what we've put into it, 63%. And if you look at countries like Haiti and Pakistan and Mozambique and countries that are really on the front lines of this hazard and harm, they cumulatively, the 10 most vulnerable, most climate vulnerable countries in the world cumulatively are responsible for less than 1%. So that is a kind of climate inequity. It's really injustice. And we need to look at it that way. We need to accept our responsibility to try to help these countries deal with both loss and damage that's already baked into the system, and help them become more resilient, and help them to invest in clean energy so they're part of the problem, the fix and not the problem going forward. So those are our 3 big obligations that we're seeing at the Natural Resources Defense Council, where I work. Those are our 3 big challenges this year, is to make sure that these historic investments that we're making are implemented properly, to make sure that the administration moves forward with these standards and rules that go hand in glove with that investment to make sure that that we get the most benefits possible from it. And 3, to make sure that we're living up to our commitments as a nation to other countries that are paying a price they can't afford for a problem they didn't cause. So, you know, with that, I think there's more hope than there ever has been, at least in the 13 years I've been engaged in this. And this is a very hopeful time, but we need to stay the course. There's more work to be done. And I think there's good reason to be optimistic about the future. I think that's probably a pretty good place to stop and start out with your questions like this. It looks like Alvin's got one already. So.
Well, I do have a question. What I put in the chat was my admiration for your non-technical books, which are some of the greatest books that I've ever read. I still have 3 copies of The River Where America Began myself. My question is, I saw an article the other day about the hole in the ozone over Antarctica is actually beginning to close. Do you have any comment on that?
Well, I'm glad to hear it, of course. I think that's a success story in the sense that the hydrofluorocarbons that were causing that, we took action to try to reduce those years ago. And that seems to be bearing fruit. So that's definitely good news.
Yeah, I've heard so much about what Maryland, the state of Maryland has done and is continuing to try to do. Apparently legislation passed last year on capping the, I don't know all the details,
Sure.
but, and there's current legislation that we all need to contact our representatives in Senate to support this year to follow up on that. So to what extent will the implementation of the federal laws be dependent on the states, and how do you work with that, given that we've got a lot of challenges on the state levels?
No, it's a great opportunity, actually. And the best people, I guess, are Environment Maryland and even the Chesapeake Bay Foundation. They follow that very closely and can help with the Maryland specific advocacy. About half of the states in the country have set targets for carbon reductions within their own states. And states from California to Virginia have set sort of net zero targets by, you know, sort of the middle of the century, either 2045, 2050, something like that. And so states are being very active in the states, and localities are very important because building codes, for example, have a lot to do with building efficiency, and particularly in rental housing, low-income housing. If a builder is not likely to go much beyond what is actually required. And so the building codes, when you require coming up to a certain standard for efficiency, it saves money for the owners and the renters over the long term. But that kind of thing is important. So advocating at the local and state levels is very important, can be very effective. And the other piece of it is, of course, there's a lot of this money that is coming from the federal government. It's coming through block grants, other ways it's being administered by the states. And so at every level, we need to pay attention to that. At NRDC, we have a pretty assertive state campaigns. In the Midwest, we're building more in the South. That's very much a building thing for us. We're active in Virginia and North Carolina, and we're trying to expand that. But in the Midwest, we're very active because it's important out there.
Going back to your comment about the countries that have contributed least are being most affected. What are like the reasons behind that? Is it because of the locate? I don't know what's caused that discrepancy.
I think the biggest piece is that they're you're talking about people who are living close to nature, if you will,
Okay.
Not insulated from the impacts, and they don't have the resources to cope with it. They don't have the resources to harden their infrastructure against the impacts of worsening storms, floods, fires, drought. that kind of thing. And so, for example, the Horn of Africa right now, you have 37 million people who've been pushed to the brink of starvation because that they're experiencing their worst drought in 40 years. And so a drought around here, it's hot, hurts the farmers, hurts the ranchers, but we get through it. But if you're living outdoors, if you're living close to the land, if you're if you're subsisting on what you grow on your land or the livestock that you can raise, and your cattle die, your goats die, your pigs die, you're done. And so that's why you have almost 40 million people on the brink of starvation just in the Horn of Africa alone. And so that's one example.
Yeah, well, what happened over the last years with the rainforest in Brazil? At least there might be hope with Lula trying to fight it back, which that's some place to look for. But it's,
That's another hopeful thing, is that Bolsonaro is gone.
yeah, we hope.
How is the faith community involved in this policy? We know about interfaith power and light. We know about the things that we as an individual congregation are doing. And we'll have a session on our new solar panels coming up in April, which is a big deal. But in general, how's the faith community involved?
I think more and more. I think that's another point of light, if you will. There's a lot of hope because, writers like Tish Harrison Williams, who you all probably read, and others have been writing very powerfully about our obligation and our opportunity to be better stewards through this. And it's also, my own personal experience is a bit of an overlay. There's quite an overlay between a strong faith community and conservatives in this country who have been part of a pushback against the action that we need to take. And so I'm hopeful that there'll be some, we'll see some evolution there as well. But what we do know is this, that 2/3 of the country, a little bit more than 2/3 of the country actually expects Washington to do more to confront the climate crisis. And as people are seeing these jobs come into their communities, the largest solar panel manufacturing plant in the Western Hemisphere is in Northwest Georgia. I think you all know who represents Northwest Georgia in the Congress. And so as more people are seeing the jobs coming from this, right now today, 3.2 million Americans get up, suit up, roll up their sleeves and go to work every day, helping us to make our homes and workplaces more efficient, helping us to get more clean power from the wind and sun, helping us to build in this country some of the best all-electric and hybrid cars anywhere in the world, and helping us to modernize our grid so that it's more resilient and better able to take on clean energy nationwide. And so those 3.2 million Americans are part of this whole new workforce, and that's growing dramatically. As a matter of fact, there have been articles in the last couple of weeks talking about, are we going to have enough workers for the clean energy transition? And I spoke just Friday to some of our people who work very closely with the unions, and the unions said, we're on top of it. The International Brotherhood of Electrical Workers, which has been doing apprenticeship programs for 70 years, they said, we have the most aggressive outreach program we've had in decades, talking to military veterans, going to underserved communities, working with people to get them into apprenticeship programs to train electricians. We're seeing the same thing in other trades that are very important to the clean energy transition. So we're confident that American workers are stepping up. And one of the reasons is that these clean energy jobs are paying on balance 25% more than the median wage nationally. So as employers are demanding these workers and they're willing to pay for them, we're seeing more workers become available for that force.
I was struck, I had the wonderful opportunity to go to southern France last summer after recovering from an illness, and I was struck that all of these little villages in southern France, each village had like in a playing field of solar panels. I mean, and that's something that our mindset, I don't think maybe will, I'm hoping will evolve, I guess, because I think the efficiency of having your power derived from these, large fields takes away the onus of putting I'm sure you have to pay whatever, of putting in individual solar panels on houses that we're looking at the solar development in that kind of way. I mean, it just was so different from what we had thought, what I thought about. So anyway, I don't know. That's hopeful.
I hope y'all can hear Carol. What Carol's talking about is the proliferation of opportunities for solar panels around the country. And I talked to a businessman out in Cleveland a couple weeks back, and he has built a business now around, he is simply goes to people who own large parking lots, whether it's an apartment building owner, a hotel, a shopping mall. And he goes to these people and he says, my company will do the financing and we will come in and build shelters over top of your parking lots. We're going to put solar panels on those shelters. You can use the power for your apartment or retail mall or whatever. And you can set up some of this power to, you can assign certain spots for electric cars. People can come if they know they can recharge while they're shopping. It's another incentive to come to your place. And so he's building these things. And when you look, when you fly around the country, if you fly particularly into Phoenix or Santa Fe or something, and every place is baking, and you see cars, thousands of cars baking in the sun, and you say every single one of those should be shielded from the sun, and there should be solar panels on top of it. And that's a great opportunity. So people are doing that. And of course, the part of this new package of incentives that the Congress enacted last August includes tax credits to help people like us cut by about a third the cost of installing solar panels on our rooftops. So we're going to be seeing a whole lot more of that as well.
When we have our presentation in April about the church's installation, part of that is going to be a discussion of different kinds of financing models for solar power for residential use. And there are companies that offer essentially no cost to the homeowner for the installation. Then they own the system and buy back any excess power, and they sell the power to the homeowner, so that it's very cost effective. And of course, there's a micro scale dimension to this that we'll be talking about next week with Clint Kelly and Carl Klontz about installation in places that are off the grid, where this is not just making cleaner energy, but bringing energy for the first time.
Hugely important across the developing world as well.
Yeah.
Another point on that is that these tax credits include up to a $7,500 credit for a new electric car, up to $4,000 credit for a used electric car. So this is helping to put electric cars, make them more affordable, particularly for low income and middle income folks.
Yeah, because you have to charge them. It costs $2,000 plus to put in the charging stations in your house.
No.
And we also have to figure out how the level of energy available to do that.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's
There's
all
some
complicated.
online
Oh,
question.
okay, thank you.
Who has the hand raised electronically there?
Michael, I see Michael.
Ellen.
Oh, yeah. Ellen got it, yeah. I think she's muted.
Okay,
There you go.
can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, now, yeah.
So Bob, what can I do with limited time and limited money, but some time and some money? What would be the most effective thing for me to do to make sure this stuff is implemented through the states?
Well, I would say, are you here in Maryland or in Virginia?
Bethesda?
Bethesda? Well, I would say that in Maryland, we're probably going to be in pretty good shape, but it never hurts to write and encourage, let people know. One of the things that we try to do, Ellen, is tell people as citizens, what we can do are three things. Number one, understand what's at stake. And so having conversations like this are really important. So you know that it is important. This is not on autopilot. States are going to have enormous discretion with respect to how this is used. So understand what's at stake. Number two, raise your voice, write letters to, you could write letters to the new governor. You could write letters to your delegate, your state level delegate, whether it's here in Maryland or in Virginia. And number three, hold these folks to account. And I mean that in a good way as well as a bad way. In other words, thanking people when they do the right thing. Let's just say making them pay a price when they don't, and making sure that we understand the difference between the two. And so I think contacting people, letting them know, letting Jamie Raskin know, we appreciate your vote last year on the Inflation Reduction Act. We appreciate the fact that not a single person from the other party in the House or the Senate supported these historic investments. And for that reason, we appreciate you, Jamie, for standing up and doing that, letting people know you appreciate it. And as far as what's going to happen in the other states, it's just going to be so state specific, but particularly in places like Virginia and other places. I think as far as the investment goes, these states are excited about that. But on the infrastructure side, it's important that the infrastructure investments go to things like supporting, improving public transit, this kind of thing. So
should we be responding positively to the endless stream of flyers we get from Clean Energy Choice in the mail?
I don't know about Clean Energy Choice. What is that?
It's a company that gives us an alternative to Pepco.
Oh, I see.
And they generate energy through renewable resources.
And I think you can also sign up through Pepco for 100% renewable power too. So, but I'm sorry, I don't know the facts on that, Steve. So I don't want to mislead you.
You're lucky you don't get their influence.
Maybe I do.
That's a different environmental problem. All the pavement.
My wife makes sure I know what it never sees the light of day.
Okay.
I think Michael has a question.
Michael.
Yeah, a wonderful presentation, and thank you so much. I am professionally a judge with the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, and so I am professionally prevented from, having a view one way or the other, pro or anti-nuclear. But as an outsider, but somebody who's spent a lot of time looking at this, it's always seemed rather odd to me that we have left-leaning folks who feel we really have to do something about climate change, but who are against nuclear, which is not carbon emitting. And at the same time, we have right-leaning folks who are, pro-nuclear in every respect, and yet they deny that climate change is even out there. And so you have to me, you have this sort of bizarre paradox that the very people who are for it deny climate change, and the same people that are against it think it's a bad thing. And so I'm wondering if you've noticed that same phenomenon, and if you have any views about it, because I'm at the NRC now for 14 years, and it's always struck me as a really bizarre thing. I'll leave it there.
No, that's great. They're great observations, Mike, and obviously true. And we have a great tradition of NRC connections here at the church. So it's great to hear about that. Let me try and deal with the technical policy side of it, and then the cultural piece of it. First off, at NRDC, Our view is this, nuclear power is providing, and correct me if I'm wrong, my most recent numbers I've seen, roughly 20% of the electricity in the country. We don't see that going up or down in the near term. So we're kind of on that. We feel like nuclear power has to be safe. It has to be sustainable, meaning we need to find a permanent solution to the waste. It has to pay for itself. And of course, as you've seen in Barnwell in South Carolina, and the troubles that they're having, but staying on budget at Vogel in Georgia, that the paying for it piece has been a challenge. So that's kind of where we are on that. There is this promise of a new generation of nuclear power that's going to address a lot of the cost issues and sustainability issues. We're hopeful. We're looking forward to that, but it's not out yet. So on the cultural piece, it is interesting, and it's unfortunate that so many issues have become tangled up in a kind of a cultural contest across the country. If you look at the greatest conservationist president we ever had was Teddy Roosevelt, a Republican president. Dwight Eisenhower created the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge. Ronald Reagan got the lead out of our gasoline.
Nixon created the EPA.
Nixon created the EPA. Thank you, Steve. George H.W. Bush went after acid rain. Even George W. Bush, a Texas oil man, said in a State of the Union address, we have a problem in this country. We're addicted to oil. We need to do something about it. And so it's unfortunate that this has gotten kind of wrapped around this cultural contest axle, if you will, here in this country in our politics, because it makes so much sense. And I'm very hopeful now that we have an opportunity to break out of that with this new jobs and investment and manufacturing renaissance that's being driven by this shift to clean energy. And I hope that that eventually bleeds over so that we can have a more rational conversation about these other technologies, as you mentioned, Michael. I hope that's responsive.
Ricky?
Bob,
Okay, go ahead, Michael.
I was just going to say, I think that's it looks like the real question boils down to, eventually we're hopefully going to have really good storage, which will allow us to use more renewables. Eventually we're going to have a better conservation, which is going to reduce our demand for electricity. And at some point we may actually have fusion. So, we've got some non-nuclear issues available, but there is this bridge between now and that point. And I think the ultimate question is, how are you going to fill that gap? And are you going to fill that gap with nuclear, or are you going to fill it with natural gas? Because it seems to me that's basically your option for this bridge period. And this whole bizarre pro-nuclear, pro-natural gas, but anti-climate change on the one hand, and real concern about climate change, but then denying both of those options, I think makes it a real challenge. And at least that's the way I see it. Again, because I can't express an opinion on the nuclear issue, or that's my job, not to have an opinion. So, but anyway, it just strikes me as a interesting conundrum.
Well said. And it used to be my job when I was a journalist, but it isn't anymore. So I appreciate your position.
Brigitte, you've got your hand up there.
Yeah. Yeah, thank you, Bob. This is really interesting, and some of the comments. And, I just spent several weeks in Germany, and of course, this discussion over, I have some very left-leaning friends who have not ever owned a car. They do their house calls as physicians on bike and have been for decades. And I've protested against the nuclear, and now of course Germany is going back to to coal to fill gaps, and France is way ahead of the curve because they never got rid of their nuclear power plants. So it's an interesting discussion. My observation has been is, so I'm glad that all these things are happening on this national and state level. But again, walking around just villages in Germany, just seeing how many people have solar on their roofs, those are not wealthy people. Everybody seems to know what to do. And I have a hard time with all these flyers coming in, even figuring out. I've signed up for 100% renewables, a few years ago. These flyers that we get, so I actually do it through the gas supplier that I chose many years ago. It's just a bit more expensive, but where to start to make your home more efficient beyond, filling the cracks and all these things to put solar. It's, do we have a list as our people who know more about environmental issues to where even to start, with all the options for homes?
No, that's a good question. I could point you to a couple of places on the NRDC website, or you could just go to nrdc.org and type in, consumer choice or something like that. But there are recent articles about it. Again, to go back, the package of incentives that were enacted by Congress last August includes a lot of new options for homeowners. So, for example, if you want to invest in a heat pump, which is much more efficient than a 20-year-old furnace, there's money to help you do that, covering about 30% of the cost of the equipment. So that helps these things to pencil out for people. Something as simple as getting an energy audit, having somebody come out and look at your house and find out where heat is leaking from your windows, or if you or a roof or something like that. All of that is important. But I do think you point to something which is, it's complicated. You start to think, what do I need? How am I going to pay for it? What incentives are there to help me do it? It gets very complicated, and you point to a need for some kind of consolidated place you might go to for good information on that. If I come across one, I'll send it to you.
Yeah, but Bob, even just to then to evaluate the companies. Let's say you get 3 or 5 companies who install solar, or after you've had your audit, and even knowing how it's I'm sure with a lot of research you can find that, but it's hard to even. If we could have a list of where to start, do you think I can find that on the NRDC?
I know they did that. I know we do have something on our website that is a consumer's guide to the Inflation Reduction Act that tells you, what's available in there in terms of tax credits, whether it be for home improvements or purchasing an electric car or whatever the case might be.
Okay.
Well, the home energy analysis, check with Pepco.
Yeah, Pepco does.
They, I think, will subsidize the cost of that so that it won't cost a homeowner more than $100 to get it done.
Right, that's my understanding too.
Yeah, we had one done a few years ago and found some surprising cold spots in our house. Alvin, I think you got your hand up again.
Yes. Bob, I'm interested in how closely you might tie climate change to what seems like a increasing intensity in the storms that we experience, certainly in the United States, but around the world.
Well, what we say, Alvin, is that climate change doesn't cause these things, but climate change is the stage it plays out on. So, for example, when you warm the atmosphere, it will hold more moisture. And what is heat? What is warmth? It's energy. And so a storm that will linger over the Gulf of Mexico for 4 or 5 days over waters that are 4 or 5 degrees warmer than normal because of climate change, that storm is packing a wallop because it's taking heat from over those waters and it's taking moisture. and it will hold more so that when it comes on into Houston and drops, a record amount of rain in 36 hours and causes flooding that the city just can't cope with. That's the kind of thing we're talking about. Or this kind of mega drought we've been seeing in the West. Now, the last week, in Southern California, it's been a different story, but we're looking at the worst drought in 1,200 years across the American Southwest. And if you look at the two largest reservoirs in the country, like Meade being one of them, these reservoirs now are down to a quarter of a tank of water, and they've never been that low. And so these things, this is happening because of warming temperatures around the world. And we've just seen, last year was the 6th hottest year on record since global record keeping began in around 1880. And the 10 hottest years on record have all occurred since 2010. So that's the situation we're in, and we're seeing the results all over.
I saw a discussion recently online that researchers are now looking at the effects of natural gas on the environment at the micro level. And there's a proposal out to ban gas stoves going forward. That would be huge.
I'm really glad you brought that up.
Half the cooks in America would be up in armed rebellion.
But induction stovetops are much better. They
So
are.
let me just, I'm really glad you brought it up, because I think in the past 5 days, everybody in America who owns a typewriter has written about about the gas stove prohibition movement, which doesn't exist. And what happened was one of the 5 commissioners on the Consumer Product Safety Commission was being interviewed by Bloomberg. In the interview, the Bloomberg reporter said, "Have you seen this new report that links gas stoves to asthma, particularly in children?" And the commissioner made a comment, if they're not safe, they can be banned. And so all of a sudden I will just say that was messaging gold for our friends on the other side. And they took that and said, "Oh, this is great." They rubbed their hands together and said, "Now the lefties want to come after your gas stoves." Now, within hours, the commissioner made clear that's not what's happening. And by the way, that was one of 5 commissioners on the independent Consumer Product Safety Commission. And they all made clear it's not happening. The White House made clear we have no earthly intention of doing it, but that didn't stop Tucker Carlson and others from saying, now they're coming for your gas stoves, and putting grandma on TV saying, how am I going to make my jelly anymore? And oh my goodness gracious. So just to be clear, there is no gas stove prohibition movement. Now, some localities, some cities have said that after a certain year, we should not be installing any more new gas stoves because we have better options that are better for the environment. They're also more economical. And a lot of cooks, Carol mentioned induction top stoves. A lot of chefs love those induction top stoves because the second you turn them on, your water boils before you have time to find your sugar. And so anyway, but just to be clear, yeah, the NRDC is not supporting a ban of stoves. There is no gas stove prohibition movement, and we can.
But if you have asthma and you have breathing problems, I have to tell you, while I was sick and trying to get better, a friend of mine was helping me cook all the time, and we started getting breathing. I have an open. I don't have a hood. It's one of those things where it sucks it out. We started getting major problems cooking on my gas stove. And I had no idea. that this was a reality, that the gas could try, but we both did. And so, you know, there is
And you
something
replaced
to.
it with an induction
We,
stove?
no, I haven't done that because of the cost, but my friend.
We're just eating
actually-
raw food now.
My friend actually did put an induction top, and it's fabulous. I can't tell you, it totally revolutionizes how you have to do anything. It's great. But the truth is that you have to watch out with those gas stoves. That they can cause breathing problems. So
Well, Steve,
they-
you obviously, I touched a nerve. I'll close with a personal anecdote, which is
Yeah.
that a couple of years ago, we redid our kitchen. And I wisely recognized that I was not going to have a role in this other than to write checks. And so that was a step toward domestic tranquility, was recognizing that.
And a more perfect union.
And a more perfect. But my wife had her own ideas about who is a wonderful cook, and her mother's from New Orleans, so enough said. And, you know, she had very specific ideas about the kind of stove she wanted. And I said, you know, a lot of chefs are liking these induction stoves. And she said, that's not your role, and
That's what I thought, yeah.
step back. But
I did the
a couple
same
of months ago,
thing.
about a year after our kitchen was completed, no small effort, she came home from a trip she had taken and was telling me about this new electric induction stove that a friend first had, how wonderful it was to cook on. I had the good sense, I can thank God, to say nothing.
Do Louise have something in the
In this
chat?
view, I can't see any more raised hands. So if you have a question, shout it out.
And if not, it's been great visiting with you this morning.
This is a topic that
Yeah.
we can revisit in many forms, many times without it ever getting repetitive. Bob, with the 30,000-foot view here is a great way to start this consideration, and to look at the faith dimensions of it as well, with the activity of faith communities and what we're doing as members of a larger community as well as an individual congregation. We've got at least two more presentations coming up soon, maybe three. Next week, we'll go from 30,000 feet down to ground level as Carl Klontz and Kelly talk about the downstream social effects of introducing solar power into a village, whether in Africa or in Bangladesh, and the uses that power gets to and how it changes lives in very dramatic ways. And then later in the spring, we'll be talking about the new solar installation on our roof here at church. Unfortunately, you can't see those solar panels from the street. You've got to go up to some of the second floor rooms and look out onto the church roof to actually see them. But they will be cutting our electricity costs by about 80% this year,
Wow.
which is pretty dramatic. And you know, I can't wait to hear more about this. And we have environmental experts in the congregation who are always more than willing to speak. We could turn this into the environmental hour almost, but there are so many other things to discuss that we like to come back and dip into it from time to time. So thank you all for good questions. Go out and enjoy your gas stoves.
Bob, can you send a follow-up email with the link?
Yes, I will. I will.
So it's
We can post it to the church website for adult ed.
You bet.
Okay, great, thanks.
All right. Thank you all.
Thank you, Bob.
Thank you, Bob.
Excellent.
Bob.
See
Thank you all.
see you in-
Good to see you.
We'll see you in church in 20 minutes.
Thank you both.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for having me.